To kick off day 2 of the 2012 summit, we plan to start with a big picture view of the state and the ever-expanding global media sphere. And to do that, we've brought in Geoff Ramsey, founder and CEO of New York-based eMarketer, one of the world's leading providers of research and insights on digital media, marketing, and commerce. Please help me welcome Geoff Ramsey.
Thank you. Did anybody notice that there was fog out there earlier this morning? Yeah, I did too. I was not expecting that. And it's kind of foggy out there in the digital world as well, if you hadn't noticed. There's a lot of confusing statistics, a lot of different trends, a lot of researchers and analysts throwing out different opinions and so on, and it gets very, very confusing. And therefore, one has to be aware of the hype. There's a lot of media putting out misinformation or exaggerated information, so we need to be careful of that. We believe at eMarketer it's better to get a complete objective picture of the digital landscape. And therefore, we look at something like 4,000 different sources to understand what's really going on and discern the trends. And certainly, we believe in the mantra of collective wisdom, looking at as many sources as possible to discern what's really going on. And we certainly did that with the Global Media Intelligence Report. We just issued a press release on this today. It's a mega report. We refer to it as the GMI, again, Global Media Intelligence Report. I want to give a special shout out to our data partner for this effort, which is Starcom Media Vest Group, which provided us with much of the information from local levels at countries all around the world. This report that I'm going to be talking about today, in the time I have, covers 40 markets, something like 270 pages, and 700 charts. Now, I don't have 2 hours on stage. Apparently, I only have 18 minutes, so I had to make a choice. Either I'm going to cut this information down, way down, or I'm going to talk quickly. I've decided mostly to talk quickly. So you'll have to, if you went to Ferrari World, you know that they have the world's fastest roller coaster ride. That's what you're about to go through now. We're going to go through more information than is humanly possible to absorb. So let's get into it. And there's three parts to this. Part one is looking at the digital consumer today all around the world. Apparently, according to IBM, there's 1 trillion devices connected to the internet. I don't know how they come up with those numbers, but that's what they came up with. If you look at the world, the entire population of 7 billion people, 32% are online. So that equates to essentially 1/3 of the planet are active internet users accessing the web. Half of those, or 1.1 billion, are in Asia alone. Of course, that's the global average at 32%. If we look at North America and Western Europe, they're way ahead. Eastern Europe and Latin America, behind, but at critical mass levels. And then you have Asia Pacific at about 27%, and Middle East and Africa as the whole region at about 16%. I understood from a gentleman behind the screen here that the UAE is at about 65% penetration. So again, averages can be misleading. But we see the whole Middle East, Africa region rising to 21% penetration by 2016. Broadband is probably the more important thing to look at from a media and marketing perspective. Anybody in media and marketing here? You are at the 2012 Media Summit, so just checking. North America and Western Europe are over 60% in terms of percent of households on broadband. Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia Pacific kind of neck and neck at around 30%. But you have to look at like Asia Pacific at 28% average. That's averaging countries like Indonesia, which are at 2% broadband penetration, or South Korea at 90% plus, 93%. Middle East and Africa as a whole region, around 5%, much higher here in the UAE. In many countries, the most active internet users will spend easily 20 plus hours a week online. And we find, at least in the developing world, there's a huge youth skew such that somewhere in the range of 2/3 to 3/4 of internet users tend to be under 34 years old. If we switch gears and look at mobile for a second, about 56% of the entire world's population have a mobile device or access to a mobile device. If we look ahead to 2016, we find that the number is closer to 2/3 or 66%. So 2/3 of people on the planet by 2016 will have a mobile device that they use all the time. Of course, that's a global average, and we see that many countries and regions in the world are much higher. You might be surprised that Argentina and Russia are at an excessive 70% penetration rate for mobile. No surprise, but some markets like Brazil, India, Asia Pacific, Mexico, and Middle East and Africa as a region are behind in terms of mobile penetration. But the story here is one of growth where we see rapid undertaking of the mobile device. Middle East and Africa we see growing from 37% to 44%. Africa brings that average down. UAE would bring it up. In many countries and regions around the world, the mobile phone is the #1 media in terms of penetration, even beating television, okay? And then if we look at markets like China, 880 million mobile users, that equates to over 1/5 of all global mobile users in the world. But of course, the story with mobile is not just any feature phone, it's smartphones, and I'm sure you all have smartphones here. It's like a desktop computer in your pocket that you walk around 24/7. This is the better opportunity for marketers and media folks to reach people and do interesting things with, because people who have smartphones are super users. They do everything more with their smartphone. They access video more, they access social media more, they get online more. It's like a 2x factor when you have a smartphone. So we have to look at that very carefully. Right now, almost 1 billion people, let's just roughly say 1 billion people on the planet have a smartphone. What's interesting here is to watch the rapid growth of smartphone penetration among mobile users. Globally, it's at 24%. North America and Western Europe are ahead, and so is Eastern Europe. Slightly behind are Latin America and Asia Pacific, with the Middle East and Africa at about 13%. But watch how things grow in just the next 4 years. Globally, it goes to 45%. Western Europe and North America grow over 70%. Latin America and Asia grow rapidly. Middle East and Africa grows to 29%, pretty much reaching critical mass. So big story there. And if we look at individual countries, Japan goes from 33 to 83% penetration with smartphones. China grows from 27% to 43%, but that's 500 million people in that country alone that are on smartphones. Again, it's a story of, it tends to skew towards youth, those under 34. Where is broadband going? There's an interesting story here too, because if we look at just the G20 developed countries in terms of internet access, in 2005, it was almost all fixed line at your desktop. Then by 2010, it was kind of 50-50, skewed towards mobile, and then we see a huge spin towards the mobile device as your broadband connection in 2015 on a worldwide basis. Anybody on social media here? Somebody might be Twittering right now. I'll get to you later. What you see is that 1.4 billion people on the planet access social networks. That's more than the entire population of China. It is 1 out of every 5 people on the planet, and it's 62% of all internet users. If you believe the media hype, you might think that 100% of us are doing that, but that's just not the case. That's the global average at 62%. What we find is that Asia and Western Europe are behind. North America is just slightly ahead, and you might not be surprised at this. Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East and Africa are at around 70% penetration of internet users. Now, that's among internet users. If you look at the populations as a whole, for instance, in the Middle East and Africa, it's only 11% of the entire population that's on social media due to the low incidence of internet penetration in much parts of Africa. A lot of people are interested in China. What % of internet users in China are on social networks? You can see a lot of different data from different research sources. I mean, it ranges from 23 to 77%. What are we supposed to do with that? It's like you want to get the researchers into the same room. Would you guys just hash this out? And that's what we try to do at eMarketer. We look at the different definitions and methodologies and biases and try to discern what is the true number. And looking at some very reputable sources, we see convergence around about 50%. But make no mistake that 54% of internet users in China who are on social networks equates to 308 million people, which is over 1/5 of all social network users worldwide. So very, very interesting development in China. In many markets, social network users account for 20% of their time is spent on social media like Facebook and Twitter. This is data from ComScore that shows Russia and Argentina are right up there, spending over 10 hours a month on social media. It's interesting to note what some people have to say about the quality of that time. Recently, I was at a conference where the CEO of Forrester Research, George Colony, was quoted as saying about social media, he said 55% of social media time is wasted. Actually, as a research geek, I would put that at 48.67%, but that's just my number. We'll not quibble about that. Facebook is definitely dominant. You might have heard that they passed 1 billion users. We think it's probably closer to 826 million based on inactive accounts and people who have come and gone and moved on to other places. But what you do see is Facebook is dominant with 59% of the world's social media users on that platform. And it diverges in terms of different regions of the world where Middle East and Africa, US, and many other countries, 80 to 90% of social media users are on Facebook, whereas in countries like Japan, Russia, and South Korea, it's only around 25 to 26%, where local players have a much bigger play in those markets. That's looking at the consumer. Now let's take a look from the marketer's perspective and understand what they're doing. It's a crazy world for marketers out there, and that's why Maurice Levy, who is the CEO of Publicis, the large ad agency holding company, said recently, brands want to be connected to consumers, so they have to be connected too. I couldn't agree more. Let's look at the media spending picture, looking at television, radio, print, indoor, outdoor, newspapers, magazines, the internet, roll it all up and look at the growth rate on a global basis, and you'll find that it's 6.8%. That's one of the higher numbers out there. eMarketer is relatively bullish compared to some other research companies and analyst firms. But what we see is North America, because of their economy, and Western Europe certainly are behind that 6.8%. Middle East and Africa on the other end of the spectrum, closer to 13%. Latin America slightly behind that, along with Eastern Europe and Asia Pacific at about 11% growth rate this year. And yet you have to look at individual countries like Indonesia and China that are growing at a 20% rate. And same in Argentina and Russia at 15% and 20%. But now let's look at a comparison between total media spending growth, again, worldwide at 6.8%, and compare that to digital media, where it's 2.5 times that rate of growth at 19%. It's a obviously much faster growing pie, and it equates to over $100 billion that is spent globally on digital media. Again, 19% is the global average. If we look at individual regions, more developed markets where the internet has been part of the advertising mix for a long time, you find that the US and Western Europe are behind in terms of their growth rate. But no surprise, Russia is way ahead. Asia Pacific, 140% growth in digital media spending in Indonesia, and about 40% in China and India, and that's a conservative estimate. And we see the same in Latin America, where the growth rate for digital media is around 40%. In Middle East and Africa, we're estimating just under 50% growth for digital advertising. It's also good to get some perspective to understand where digital media fits into the bigger picture. And we find that globally, marketers and media companies spend about $540 billion, and the internet accounts for about a little less than 20% of that. And you find that the UK, Germany, and US developed markets, again, are well over the 20% rate spent on digital. You might be surprised that Russia is about 20%, just above the average. Behind the average is China, Brazil, Indonesia, and India, for example. And then based on data that we have from the report, the Middle East is around 3 or 4%, depending on which source you look at. So a lot of opportunity for growth here in the Middle East and Africa, where currently they're spending 60 to 75% of their media dollars in newspapers at this time. That will change rapidly. Another way to look at it, and to give some perspective, on a proportionate basis, is to look at internet ad spending per internet user. And what we find is the worldwide average is about $46. The UK and Australia way ahead of that. Same with US, Canada, Germany, and Japan. Well over $100 spent by marketers on internet advertising. But behind are Brazil and China, and the Middle East and Africa is only at $4 per internet user. So again, lots of room for growth here. If we look at it on an absolute aggregate basis by region, what we see is that North America is and will continue to be the leading market for digital ad spending in terms of absolute dollars through 2016. What's interesting to see is that Asia Pacific goes from number 3 to number 2 in 2013. And by the year 2016, it's around $53 billion, just a little bit behind North America, but well ahead of Western Europe. So big growth in digital media in Asia by 2016. Middle East and Africa is around $800 million spent in digital media. That grows by a factor of over 3x to $2.8 billion by 2016. Mobile ad spending, everybody's talking about mobile. What we see today in the year 2012 is that Asia Pacific is the leader in the world in terms of total ad spending, with the US right behind that and Canada. 63% of mobile spending in the world is concentrated in the US and Japan. The world changes dramatically over the next 4 years, and North America goes way ahead to $12.4 billion, which is fully half of the $25 billion that will be spent by marketers worldwide on mobile ad spending in that year. The Middle East and Africa will still be at a relatively negligible $10 million by that year. But mobile is a story of growth. Even in a developed, aggressive digital market like the US, we're looking at 80% growth. That's eMarketer's number. Other researchers are in a range of 33% to 80%. And some of the latest numbers coming in show over 100% growth for mobile marketing. We still think it's closer to 80%, but off a very large number of $2.6 billion. What that equates to over the next 4 years in the US is 4.6x growth, 4.6 times the growth that we see in 2012. What's interesting to do is compare that to some other regions of the world, and we find that the growth is even higher in more underdeveloped markets. Germany, 5.4, up to Indonesia at 12.8x growth in just that 4-year time period. But you also have to keep in mind that it's a relatively small base. In fact, it's only $8 million in mobile ad spending, for instance, in Indonesia. We see the same trend in Middle East and Africa, where the growth rate is very high, but the total amount spent across the region is only $3 million this year. That will grow rapidly, though. Another way to look at it is to look at mobile ad spending as a percent of total media spending, that 540 billion pie we saw before. Essentially, mobile equates to 1.2%, a very small slice of the pie. And we see a gap, even in the US, where mobile ad spending is 1.6% of the total, but the share of media time is closer to 10% for consumers. So there's a gap there, and we see that worldwide. Looking at the $100 billion global digital media pie, we find that mobile is at around 6%, and that's actually about the same for social media at about 6.4%. And Facebook is definitely dominant there once again, with about 63% of global social media ad dollars. Now for the final conclusion, I just want to kind of open our minds and not look at statistics so much and think about the next paradigm of media and marketing that we need to be aware of. And it all starts with the consumer, which we all know is empowered today in ways they never were before. They're more skeptical, they're more resistant to advertising messages, and there's a general lack of trust. Okay, the consumer can get information anywhere, anytime, particularly if they have a smartphone, so they're going to be watching you very carefully. What that means is that the whole paradigm of push marketing, where we push messages out to consumers and hope that they'll react and respond and buy our stuff, is waning. And it means that it won't go away entirely, but it will have less and less effect. What marketers are realizing is they need to shift from a push mentality to a pull mentality, where marketers, perhaps working with their agencies and maybe even other publishers, are creating what we like to call magnetic content, where you pull consumers in because you create advertising messages, or maybe not even advertising, but you create services, you create compelling information or entertaining content that consumers actually welcome. They want to see it and they want to share it with other people. Again, at eMarketer, we refer that to as magnetic content. It's attracting the consumer rather than trying to distract them with a message that is not welcome. And we see many marketers trying to do that. Magnetic content is really less about hunting, where we hunt the consumer down and target them, And it's more about fishing a more patient exercise where the whole premise is to find the right bait. In this case, the marketer is looking for the right content that will attract the consumer and bring them in, and maybe other consumers that weren't even on their radar screen. Marketers are doing this all over the world. They're doing it on YouTube. They're doing it on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter. They're creating content, again, that consumers actually want to see. As the head of digital marketing at Ford recently said, we need to stop thinking like message-driven marketers and more like human beings. I could not agree more. And in fact, one example of that is Burberry, the luxury goods maker. They created a microsite where you can go and you see this ethereal video with this evocative music. I'm not quite sure what's going on in this story. I'm getting wrapped up into it, and I'm not sure, where this is going. What I do know is that if I like one of the jackets in the video, I can go right in there and buy it. Okay, it's a little rich for my blood, but you get the idea. As another example, magnetic content that marketers create can also be useful. This happens to be my third son, who happens to love ice cream. And that's why I happen to love My Stain, which is made by Clorox, the cleaning and bleach company. They created an app that allows me to go in, whatever the stain is, type it in this case, ice cream, and I get a solution for how to get that stain out. Sometimes it's a Clorox product, and sometimes it's club soda or some other household product. That is a service that's a genuine value. So with mobile, it's particularly important to think utility, think usefulness. That pretty much wraps up our 18 minutes, so let me just say that to kind of summarize, mobile is huge. You knew it was, but the numbers show it. 2/3 of the planet will be on a mobile phone by 2016. Huge, huge growth, and absolute numbers are getting bigger in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia Pacific. Particularly watch out for Russia, Brazil, Argentina, China, India, and Indonesia. Massive growth in those regions. The Middle East and Africa are growing even more rapidly, but again, in most markets, and particularly in Africa, the base levels are very, very low. Again, the UAE is much higher than these numbers suggest. And finally, if we take away nothing else but the statistics, we need to look at with the proliferation of technologies and devices and platforms, it is really, really important that you think magnetic content instead of just trying to distract the consumer. And with that, I hope that I've been magnetic content for you, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Geoff. I think everyone in this room is already enormously better informed than when we all walked in this morning.